Hello everyone, welcome back for week 6 where our topic is pace and structure. Today we're going to take a look at the question, how can we plan efficient trainings? As for our learning objective this week, we'll be wrapping up our unit on the design portion of that ITLD model. Okay, this week our goal is to construct a storyboard for a training course or activity. That'll be project 2. And today we'll talk about how to determine an appropriate pace and structure for our training activity, as well as how to create a written outline of the activity so that we can eventually build that storyboard for project 2. So I've decided to start off today's lesson by talking about cognitive load theory. I think to truly understand how to pace and structure a lesson, we have to understand how the learning process occurs. And I think cognitive load theory is a good model with which to consider that. Okay, cognitive load theory, if you don't know, came out in the 1980s. It's published in an article by a man named John Sweller. I'm going to link that article in our Extend Your Learning if you guys are curious about this. But essentially, Sweller breaks down learning into 3 parts. Okay, the brain has to do 3 things to learn something. First, your brain has to manage the intrinsic cognitive load. Okay, this is the inherent mental load of learning a task. Okay, simple tasks have a low intrinsic cognitive load, where a complicated task might have a very high intrinsic cognitive load. Right, depending on how difficult the topic is that you're learning, that is what affects our intrinsic cognitive load. Next, we have the germane cognitive load. Okay, the germane load is related to the mental load of connecting our new information with things we previously learned. Okay, so the germane load is the connections that your brain must form to learn something. Okay, you can imagine if we bring up previous topics that we're going to connect to, that might make this simpler. Right? You might lessen that germane cognitive load. Or we might have a really complicated topic that connects to a lot of different areas that might have a very high germane cognitive load. But this gives us kind of a tool to think about that idea when the learner is making connections. That is germane cognitive load. Finally, we have extraneous cognitive load. This is cognitive load that is kind of extra. This does not fit into either category. Okay, this isn't inherent in learning the task. It is not part of the learning connection process. Okay, extraneous cognitive load usually relates to the mental load of distractions, either within the learner themselves or the learning environment. Okay, so when we talk about extraneous cognitive load, usually we talk about how to minimize distractions so that we can have as efficient a learning process as possible. Okay, but we're going to talk more about these ideas and kind of some strategies that stem from them. But I want you guys to really think about this when you're designing your learning process. Right? How much intrinsic cognitive load are you putting on your learner when you introduce a topic? How hard is that for them to connect it to previous information? And are there any distractions maybe that we can address beforehand so that learners don't get tied up? Right? This is why cognitive load is important. And as we'll see in the next slide, it really takes shape when we start to look at these different strategies. All right, the first strategy I want to talk about, many of you are probably familiar with, is the concept of chunking in education. And chunking is exactly what it sounds like. We're taking an educational process, strategy, content, and we're breaking it into pieces. Right? Instead of teaching a whole process at once, we're trying to break our content into teachable chunks. And at each step of the chunk, we're able to assess to make sure our learners are progressing accordingly. Okay, so rather than teaching them the whole process at once and maybe overwhelming that learner's cognitive load, we're giving them, well, here is step 1, right? And if we do a good job, we should assess that, make sure they understand step 1, and then we go on to step 2, and so on. Okay, this is a very useful strategy for creating modular lessons. Okay, learning modules is definitely a big thing right now in distance education and hybrid learning. And I think chunking or micro-learning fits that to the T. Okay, we're splitting our units into modules, maybe daily modules, and we're breaking that down into these teachable chunks. Now, this is a very good strategy for managing both the intrinsic and germane cognitive load that our students are going through. Okay, because instead of giving them the whole learning process, with chunking, you control how much you're giving them, how much you're asking them to expend mental load-wise, both on the topic or on connections to previous learning, right? Depending on how the chunks are set up, we might be able to build some of those connections into that learning process and make things easier, right? Presenting similar ideas at the same time, organizing our chunks so that the relationships feel natural and make sense. Okay, that's kind of the idea with chunking. Furthermore, alongside this idea of chunking, we can utilize the strategy of scaffolding. Okay, in scaffolding, we're creating our instructional chunks, but they have built-in supports that support our learners like a scaffold. And if you don't know what a scaffold is, it's a temporary structure that they use in construction while they're building the main house. Right? So in order to build our foundation, we might need a temporary support. And that's what scaffolding is. Okay? In scaffolding, learners practice a task with supports, and then that support is gradually taken away. Okay? Maybe you solve a practice problem with the steps written on the board, and then your teacher erases those steps and you try it on your own, right? That is an example of scaffolding. And with scaffolding, the goal is for our learners to be able to perform the task without support by the end of the lesson. Okay, so you start with the support, and then we're gradually taking that away so that eventually our learner can succeed without those supports. And you can imagine scaffolding can help us manage all three types of our cognitive load. Okay, it allows us to give better chunks to our learners to manage the intrinsic and germane cognitive loads. And with the scaffolding supports, we can also control some of that extraneous cognitive load, some of the confusion with how to do the process and what order, and distracted by where to look in the notes and that sort of thing, right? We can help address that. So scaffolding is a great strategy to work on all three types of that cognitive load. Now, this idea of scaffolding actually comes from another theory in education called the zone of proximal development. This one dates back to the 1920s, first proposed by a Russian scholar by the name of Lev Vygotsky, and he essentially proposed this theory as an idea of a learning sweet spot. Right? As a new learner, there are things you can do on your own, problems you can solve on your own. There are problems that you cannot solve. And there are problems that you can solve if you just have some help, right? If we have some guidance. And we call this, or Vygotsky calls this, the zone of proximal development. Okay, this is where efficient learning takes place, where we give the learner enough help that they can achieve something new, but not so much help that it's too easy, right? So this is kind of that learning sweet spot. And you can imagine this is hard to find because each learner is different and the amount of help we can give them also varies, right? But just some things to think about. If our learners don't have enough support, they won't be able to perform the learning task. Okay, so first and foremost, when we're scaffolding, we have to give our learners enough support so that they can be successful. However, if our learners have too much support, we might be practicing inefficiently. Right? We don't want to give them problems that are too easy or too streamlined, so that way when we remove the support, they're lost, right? We want to give them kind of just the right amount of help so that it's a challenge still. We want them to be challenged. So you can imagine how good scaffolding can help our learners find this zone of proximal development, find this sweet spot of learning where we're efficient, we have the tools we need to be successful, but we are still challenged. Right? We're still challenged and working hard, and our brains are working and developing these ideas. That is the zone of proximal development. All right, we've talked a lot about pace so far, right? How to break our content into appropriate size chunks, how to make sure we have the right instructional supports for each chunk so that our learner is progressing throughout the lesson. Okay, well, how do we now, as instructional designers, sum that up, right? And that process, one of the common ones at least, is called storyboarding. So storyboarding is a cinema technique or a storytelling technique, which is essentially we're breaking a story down scene by scene. Okay, we usually include a quick visual and description. Okay, you can see an example storyboard on the left here. And instructionally, storyboarding is a fantastic way to break our lesson down into those chunks and to show kind of what's happening or describe what's happening each step of the way. Now, perhaps you're thinking, well, how do I tell the story of my content? What does a story look like when I'm teaching a lesson? Right? Well, that's where structure comes in. And as far as educational structure goes, there's a lot of different ways to do it. One popular one that I'm going to talk about today is Gagne's Events of Instruction that he came out with in 1965. But essentially, if you're not sure how to build your lesson, what the beginning, middle, and end look like, you can take a look at instructional systems like Gagne's here. Okay, so Gagne has 9 events of instruction that consist of 1, gaining the attention of the learner, 2, stating the learning objectives, 3, stimulating prior recall. Okay, we're trying to facilitate those connections that are going to be made, right? The germane cognitive load. Well, that's the idea here, right? We're trying to prime those connections. 4, we present the actual content. 5, provide guidance. 6, elicit performance. Okay, have the students try it out after you've showed them the problem. You've given them some guidance, some advice. 7, provide feedback on their performance. 8, assess that performance. And 9, enhance retention. Okay? So if you're not sure how to tell the story of your lesson or tell the story of your training, okay, borrow Gagne's method here, and you can just go in order and think about how will I gain the attention of my learners on this topic? How am I going to tell them the learning objective? How can I stimulate that recall, and so on? Okay, so this is a great structure for you to use if you're not sure what direction to go in on your storyboard. Okay, I'm not going to require this setup, but it's there if you need it. Okay, and why don't we take a look on the next slide on how we can use this to write an outline for a potential instructional training. All right, let's say we want to create a storyboard, but we're not sure what our scenes are going to look like yet. Perhaps we start with a written outline. Maybe we even follow in Gagne's steps and we use those 9 events. Okay, so a written outline might look something like this. 1, we want to gain the attention of the learners. We're going to do so with a warm-up activity, and that's going to be on slide 1. Okay, I'm going to keep this really generic topic-wise just so you can kind of hopefully see it addressing your topic or your training, okay? So 1, we gain their attention. Maybe that's a warm-up. Maybe that's a problem that you're proposing to the class. Maybe it's a brainstorm activity, right? You have a lot of options there. 2, we want to state our objectives. Okay, maybe that's your introduction slide. And we're going to tell the students what we're going to learn today. 3, we want to stimulate recall. Maybe this is a review of last class on slide 3. Maybe this is just refreshing the class on some key terms that are going to be used today. Okay, but the idea with that stimulate recall is we want the ideas that we're going to connect with in our learners' working memory. Okay, so we want them thinking about what we're going to connect to make that process nice and efficient. 4, when we present content, maybe that is just straight up direct instruction, right? Slides 4 through 10 are content slides where we're going to tell the class some information. 5, when we're providing guidance, we're doing guided practice. Okay, maybe this is practice problems we're doing on the board. The students try it out, and then the teacher's going to show them right after, right? Or maybe it's an activity where the students try it out on a piece of paper while the teacher walks around and makes sure everyone's fine there. Elicit performance. Here you really want students practicing on their own. So maybe this is an individual practice. Students are doing a worksheet where we're solving these problems, or running through a practice scenario of the learned skill, right? But we want students to try it out here. 7, provide feedback. Okay, you're coaching them, you're giving them feedback directly. Maybe you're walking through practice solutions on slides 13 through 15 of your PowerPoint, right? But the idea here is that we're starting to build out the outline of our lesson, and we're thinking about what do we have to create? What do we have to create on this storyboard? 8, assess performance. Maybe that's an exit ticket. Maybe that's a quiz question at the end. Maybe that's a short assignment, right? But we want some way to check to see, have our students learned what we want them to learn? Have they met today's learning objectives? And finally, 9, enhance retention. We always want to tie ideas when possible to the next class, to the next topic, to the next idea. We're essentially priming that germane cognitive load for next time, right? We're telling the students this is important because it's going to tie into this down the road, right? This new idea. Okay, so that is an example of a quick written outline. That's something you might write down when planning a training, when planning a class. Just something quick on some post-it notes, maybe, before you actually get to the storyboard itself. All right, so once we've come up with our outline, we have an idea of the different scenes that are going to go into our storyboard. How do we represent those scenes? Well, here I have just a quick template for you guys that we'll use for this class. Okay, there's lots of different ways you can do storyboards and templates you can use, but this is what I'll be looking for Project 2 specifically. Okay, in the top left, we have our title and our scene number. In the middle here, we want some kind of visual representation, right? This can be a sketch, maybe an image you found that's relevant, diagram or chart that we're going to talk about. Okay, you can even put a cosmetic photo here if you have no instructional photos to show. Well, let's include something for the sake of our storyboard and practicing this process. So at least give me a cosmetic photo, something that you would put on that slide, maybe in the background to add flavor, that sort of thing. Okay, so in our storyboard, you're going to have title and scene number in the top. You're going to have a visual representation of that slide in the middle. And then down below, I want you guys to include the learning objective. Okay, this can change from slide to slide, or we might only have a couple learning objectives throughout our entire lesson. That's okay. Okay, but I want you guys to be aware of what do you want students to learn while on this slide? Okay, what is the objective we're working towards? A scene description, right? What is going to happen during this part of the lesson? An instructional strategy or an assessment strategy. Okay, what are you as the educator or trainer planning on doing on this part of the lesson? Is this direct instruction? Is this a think, pair, share part of the presentation. Is this, are you going to ask a probing question and have people talk about it in small groups, right? I want to know, what is your strategy during this scene? And finally, instructional supports. Okay, if there's any kind of scaffolding going on, right? Maybe you start with a lot of instructional supports and gradually wean them down. Maybe students have note takers or information on the board that they can reference, right? I really want to know just kind of, what are you thinking here? What do your students have access to in addition to what's in front of them to help them learn this content? Okay, so this is kind of the format I would like you guys to use for Project 2. As we take a look here, here's an example of my slide today. On slide 5, I was talking about scaffolding. Here is the picture I wanted to use for that slide. Okay, is an example of literal scaffolding so that I can build that connection between building a house and building knowledge, right? That was the goal with that picture there. Okay, the learning objective I was working towards on this slide is to determine an appropriate pace and structure for the training activity. Okay, so when I'm talking about scaffolding, if I'm doing a good job, I should be tying it back to pace and structure, right? That is the goal of our lesson right now. As far as the scene description, okay, on this slide, I introduced the concept of scaffolding in education. Our instructional strategy is multimedia learning here, okay, instructional video. I'm trying to teach you guys through both visual and verbal media. So we're learning through multiple directions there. That's our instructional strategy that comes with its own host of recommendations and best practices that we'll talk about down the line. But that's the strategy that we're utilizing here. And finally, our instructional supports. This is one I'm a big fan of, is slide animations. This allows me to introduce topics one by one, right? By introducing each concept individually. So that those were the instructional supports I used for our scaffolding slide. Another example, the zone of proximal development. This was slide 6. Okay, once again, our learning objective, we're still working towards pace and structure. But in this scene, what's happening is we're explaining this zone of proximal development and its relationship to scaffolding, right? That was the goal in the learning, is that you guys can better understand how to scaffold and why we scaffold with this concept of the zone of proximal development. And then my strategy and supports, just like the last slide, was multimedia learning and slide animations. Okay, so this is an example of some storyboard scenes. Okay, when you're going through this project, you'll essentially go through your whole training. You'll break it down scene by scene. And with each scene, you'll include instructions like so. And finally, I have one last example of a storyboard scene, and that's for our storyboarding project this week. Okay, and that's going to be a handout, a worksheet that is not in the slides themselves, although we do have a slide here that we're talking about, but all right. But our learning objective, what I would like you guys to learn in this storyboarding project, is how to construct a storyboard for a training course or activity. So that's what we're going to practice. Okay, what are we going to do? We're going to create our own storyboard for a potential training activity. What assessment strategy are we using here? Well, this would actually be project-based learning, right? Because we're learning how to create a storyboard through a project where you're making a storyboard. As far as instructional supports, I provided you guys with a storyboard template, some examples, and online you'll see as well we have an instructional rubric to give you guys an idea of how I'm going to grade that. Okay, so why don't we take a look at that next? All right, so here is your instructions for Project 2. Once again, we're working on this hypothetical scenario where you've been hired to manage a new training or consulting program. So feel free to continue that training program you've been talking about all semester, or you can pivot in another direction if you like. That's totally fine. But this project, we are going to create a storyboard that's going to summarize our training program. And here is my expectations for this storyboard. Okay, I would like at least 12 scenes. I would like to see at least 2 learning objectives. Okay, when you're putting the storyboard together, I would like at least 4 scenes displayed per page with a horizontal layout. And finally, I'd like you to submit that in a PDF file. Okay, so we're going to talk more about this overall format. I'll kind of show you guys what I expect here in a second. As far as the individual slides or scenes go, okay, I've kind of shown you guys the template already, but that's what I expect. That each scene has a visual representation. Each scene contains the learning objective. Okay, you don't need a different learning objective for every scene, but I expect you to write that learning objective every time. Okay, so we know what we're working towards. Obviously, we're including a scene description. We're including our instructional strategy or assessment strategy. And finally, we have any instructional supports listed, right? We're thinking of scaffolding, how to scaffold this lesson. So I really want you guys thinking about how much support your learners have or don't have. Okay? There will be some slides where maybe you don't want to have instructional supports. That's fine. Just write NA if there are none on that slide. Okay, but I do want you to include some supports throughout the lesson. All right, but that's essentially what I'm looking at and how I will be grading. Okay, 2 points each here on the overall format. And then the slides and scenes, I'll probably dock individual points if I feel like you're really missing any of these categories on those seats. Okay, as far as what this looks like, our format can pop back to PowerPoint here. And here's an example of what I want. Okay, where we have our storyboard scenes. We're showing at least 4 at a time, and it is in that horizontal mode. Okay, now how did I get this printout in PowerPoint? Okay, there's lots of different ways to get these multi-slide layouts in the different programs. I'll show you guys PowerPoint, but you're free, obviously, to do your storyboard in whatever program you'd like. But in PowerPoint, we just go to File, Print. I'm going to select Print to PDF. Okay, we can select our slide ranges or print all slides here if we're going to print them all. Sorry, all these settings are already saved. But when we're selecting how many slides per page, that is this drop down. Normally it is set to full page slides. We want to change that to at least 4 slides horizontal. Horizontal means we're moving left to right on each slide, which I tend to like more than vertical, which would be going down in each category. Okay, when we're talking orientation, okay, this is worth points. I don't want portrait orientation. That makes your slides harder to see. So I would like you guys to use landscape orientation for our storyboard. Okay, so this is kind of what I want here. You'd create your slides in PowerPoint or another program. You would print them to a PDF, putting 4 per page, at least, and landscape orientation. Okay, and you can just hit print, and that'll save your PDF. But that's what I'm expecting for Project 2. If you guys have any questions on that at all, feel free to reach out. I think I had a typo originally in the syllabus where I might have given a little too much time on this project. So instead of doing next week, it's actually due the following week on the 13th. But I thought, you know what? I'm a little late this week on the class section, so that's fine. Let's let you guys have that deadline. So this storyboard project will not be due till the 13th. Feel free to pop into office hours if you guys have any questions on any of this, like normal, or reach out through Canvas. Feel free to write me. But this is what I'm expecting, is something like this that meets all of our project needs there. Okay, so you guys have a wonderful week. That's all I got for you. Remember to check out some of those learning resources and work on that storyboard. Have a great week.